Hey there, welcome to another episode of Speaking of. Today, we're going to be speaking of gun violence in the city of Salem. And that might feel like a little bit of a random topic, but just yesterday or the day before, the city came out with a report that looked at the numbers behind gun violence here in our city. And so what I want to do is dig into some of those numbers and what it says about where we are as a community. And then I want to move into some thoughtfulness and some reflection on what does it mean for us as Christians. How do we make sense of this? Not so much on the issue of gun control or not, but more on the issue of how do we engage in a community that is feeling and experiencing the effects of brokenness and sin. One of the things that sort of prompted my interest in this topic today was because it seems that the consensus is that our city is getting more and more dangerous. If you go on sites like Nextdoor, if you go in certain Facebook groups, you'll often hear people talk about how the city and how crime is getting worse and worse, and it's getting more and more dangerous. And people feel just an increasing sense of of unease in the city. There's this growing sense, it seems, that it's dangerous in our communities, and there's increasing threat to your own livelihood where you're living, at least here in the city of Salem. And so I wanted to ask the question: is that true? I'm guessing that some of you watching this you might share those feelings. You might look at what you see in the news. You might look at what you're reading in the headlines, or you just kind of pay attention to what's going on in the community around you, and you might have that growing sense of anxiety. You worry about your children, you worry about what kind of a community they're growing up in and what kind of community they'll be living in, and you have that sense that we are living in a time that is more and more dangerous. And so I thought it would be good to look at this report and ask that question: is our community in fact getting more and more dangerous? Are you at risk if you go out into the city, if you say go into downtown, or if you go shop at Willamette Town Center? Are you at risk, and should you be afraid of being out in the community? Should you be afraid of letting your kids go out in ride the bus into downtown and those sorts of things? So this report helps answer that. Now, it doesn't give the full picture because this report is focused on the question of gun violence, and it doesn't address things like property crimes and those kinds of things, which that's a separate topic and an interesting one and a relevant one on this. But this only focuses on the question of gun violence, and so that takes into account attempted shootings, whether or not there was a fatality, and then also those instances where there have been a fatality. So the city commissioned this report a couple of years ago. They wanted, actually, I think it was at the beginning of this year, but they wanted to look back at the trends of gun violence in the city. And here's what the report is quite a number of pages long. I'll put a link to the report in the comments section so that you can actually go and read it firsthand. Here's what the key findings were in the report. First off, the homicide rate in Salem is actually quite low. It's hovering right around an average of about 3.4 per 100,000 people. That's an average over the last few years. That is actually below the nationwide average of homicides. It's a little bit higher than the statewide average. So in other words, Salem is a little higher than the average of what it would be like in other parts of the state, but it's still below the national average. And so when you hear about homicides, that right away, again, sometimes you hear instances and things that unfold and you right away assume that, well, we must have a really, really high rate. That's actually not the case. Our homicide rate is fairly low. Now, what is interesting is that the rate of homicides and the rate of shootings has tripled since the year 2019. Now, that's important because in 2019, the city of Salem and the police department made the decision to disband the gang enforcement team. So the Salem Police Department had a gang enforcement team that focused on addressing gang violence and gang activity in the city. And as I'm going to show you in a couple minutes, that is a huge that's a huge piece of data, because it turns out there's a pretty strong correlation there. So you've got to keep that in mind. So when you look at these numbers, they increase pretty drastically from 2019 to 2022, which is when most of the data comes from. It's a pretty strong increase in shootings, and you can look at the 2019 as a year where that begins to increase. COVID-19 factors into this a little bit, because what was happening when in fact, it's a fairly significant factor, I think, because 2020 schools are no longer in session. People are meeting remotely. They're going to school online. And so that gave opportunity for people to be sort of unsupervised, younger people being unsupervised, and that is probably a factor in all of this as well. And then finally, the year 2020 was a difficult year. You'll remember that was the year of the George Floyd shooting and the sort of the anger towards law enforcement in that year. There were a lot of protests in the summer of 2020 that actually then marked that increase in gang violence. In that time, there was a law that was passed here in Oregon. I think it was Measure 1008, if I'm remembering it correctly. That law changed the way that judges dealt with offenses that relate to gun violence. So what that law did is it actually allowed judges to have more flexibility for young people that were convicted of theft and firearm offenses. In other words, previous to this, a juvenile who got into trouble with the law would be put into, there were certain offenses, Measure 11 offenses, they'd actually be automatically moved into adult court. And this law changed that. The law allowed judges the flexibility to decide whether or not to move a juvenile into adult court or not. And as we're going to see, I think that factors into all of this. So some of the standards and some of the laws were relaxed, and it allowed more flexibility. It allowed more opportunity for teens to be not right away sentenced and face harsh penalties for their offenses, which on the surface of it sounds good and maybe helpful, but I wonder a little bit if that's had the unintended consequence of allowing for if it's caused some of this increase in gun violence. The demographics here are important. The demographics of those that are involved in instances of gun violence, whether as a suspect or as a victim. The majority of victims and suspects in Salem, the majority of victims and suspects related to gun violence are actually Hispanic males in a young, like 17 to 34 age group. So that gives you a demographic. It's worth noting that African Americans are disproportionately represented as well. I think, the city of Salem is like 1.2% African American people population. The number of African Americans involved in gun violence is something like 12% of the total number of people involved. So it's just a disproportionate thing. But statistically, the highest number of the highest demographic, the largest demographic is Hispanic male youth. And again, you're beginning to see, as I'm kind of going through this, you're probably beginning to see where this is going. Because it turns out that gun violence, at least in the city of Salem, is not, first of all, it's not random. And second of all, it's not things like domestic violence. It's not, things of that sort. By the huge majority of gun violence, it involves it's gang related activity. So 84%, I can just give you some numbers here just for real quick for interest. 84% of victims are male. 92% of the suspects are male when it comes to violence. 45% of victims are Hispanic. 58% are of the number are suspects are Hispanic. So the vast majority are between the ages of 18 and 34 when you include victim and suspect. In other words, when you include all people who are involved in gun violence, whether as a suspect or as a victim, the vast majority are between 18 and 34 years old. And the number of yeah, it's that number is increasing. Some people have looked at homelessness as a as they've looked at homelessness and believed that that's probably where most of the gun violence lies. And in fact, that's actually not the case. Homelessness is really not a major factor when looking at the numbers of gun violence, at least statistically speaking. So it's true that there's a significant number of there's a large increase in when you look at the number of victims. The number of homeless victims has actually increased fairly significantly, but not suspects. And usually, what you're seeing is that it's disputes over when you're looking at the homeless population. It's disputes over like property and things of that sort. But the number of when you look at the overall number, the overall total of victims and suspects involved in gun violence, the number of homeless people involved is actually statistically quite small. It's maybe increased a little bit, but that increase is proportionate to the increase in homelessness in general. So the idea that homeless people are that gun violence is heavily connected to homelessness is really just not it's not the case. Geography plays a huge part in this. There are three main regions, three main parts of the city where gun violence plays out most frequently, and that's in North Salem and then Northeast Salem along the Lancaster corridor, and then Southeast Salem, kind of by Highway 22 in Lancaster, kind of around that area. Those are the hotbeds of where gun violence has taken place. Statistically, that's where there's a larger proportion of Hispanic people who live, and so that actually correlates when you recognize and realize that the Hispanic population is by and large the largest percentage of people involved. You're seeing that's also where they live. So, what's the bottom line in all of this? That's a lot of numbers. That's a lot of statistics. What's the bottom line in this? Here's what it is. By far, most incidents of gun violence in the city are related to gang disputes. There's very, very little evidence to suggest that gun violence is a random problem in the city. In other words, your odds of being just randomly targeted or caught in the crossfire or something of that sort is the odds of that are actually statistically very, very low. By far, the source of the gun violence in the city of Salem is tied to gang activity. It's tied to known gangs who are engaged in turf wars or engaged in disputes over property or over people. Actually, it's like relationships. So a guy has a problem with another. Some guy comes after one guy's woman, and that guy will go and take out the person. That kind of thing. So gang violence is really the problem. There are actually two gangs in Salem there, and they're gangs with ties to different regions in Mexico, and so that's where a lot of this violence comes in. That makes sense when you think that, number one, the gang enforcement team was disbanded in 2019. You had a lot of unsupervised young people in 2020 as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And at sort of the outworking of that then was this rise in gang violence and gang shooting. What that means as far as sort of some practical application in terms of what do you do about all this, here's what it means. First of all, gun control and increased gun legislation is not likely, in my opinion, is not likely to really have any impact on solving this problem. And so when people see about, well, there's been this rise in numbers in gun violence in Salem, and we need more legislation, we need more laws concerning restricting access to guns. My opinion is that that's likely not going to make any difference because the people accessing weapons and using them are already trafficking in illegal guns and in illegal narcotics and things. And so they're likely not to be deterred by rules that are in place to prevent that. And so gun control is not likely to be a factor or an answer here. What is likely to make a difference, and this is where I think change needs to happen, is reinstating the gang enforcement team in the city of Salem and focusing. So that would be one thing, like putting this team back in place in the police department. so that they can then focus on addressing this problem, this growing problem of gangs. Because, by the way, the COVID-19, so when COVID-19 happens and all of these kids are left unsupervised and they don't have the structure that they were used to, then all of a sudden the gangs actually do a really good job of filling that vacuum. They actually appeal to kids who are just out on the streets and they've got nothing else going on. They're looking for a place to belong. Their home life is likely not very good. And so a gang is really an appeal there. And gangs actually do a really good job of filling that void. And so gang enforcement on the one hand is probably a part of the solution, but then focusing on early intervention with young people. So this is more of a how does the broader society address this, and that would come in the form of youth intervention, youth programs, finding ways to enfold younger people into a more structured environment, a place where they belong. So that's I think what the solution is to be is the most likely the solution that's most likely to make a difference are those two things: early intervention among the youth and reinstating a gang enforcement unit in the city. Here's what this means for you if you're watching this. I think this ought to put your mind at ease, because that question, am I in danger? Is the city of Salem a danger to me? Do I need to sort of do what I can to avoid the city and get out of it? Well, in some ways, I'm oversimplifying it here because I'm focusing only on one particular problem. But as far as the question of are you safe when you go into the city, the answer is unless you belong to a gang, you are. Statistically speaking, you really have nothing to be all that worried about. From a statistical point of view, you don't, unless you're wearing or flashing gang colors, you probably don't need to be too worried about getting targeted for violent crime on the streets. It's not to say it doesn't happen, but it is to say that statistically speaking, the odds are pretty low that it will happen to you. So I think that's one thing is it should help put your mind at ease. It should actually help sort of reassure you that no, the city is not a hotbed of crime that you need to flee from, and it's getting worse every day. And that's largely exaggerated, actually. It's not to say there isn't a problem, because obviously there is, but it's a very targeted problem, and it's a problem contained to those facing who are involved in gangs, and that's an issue. But it means that if you're just your average citizen, it's probably not something you need to be afraid of. Here's sort of the kind of related to that, and this is from a biblical point of view, from a Christian point of view. How do we approach this? There's a passage in the book of Jeremiah where God essentially comes to the prophet Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is living, and the people at this time are living in they're living in this foreign exiled land. They're living in this place that looked nothing like Jerusalem. It looked nothing like the Promised Land. They were surrounded by people known to be violent. They were surrounded by people who were really at odds with the Israelites, and they didn't share the same culture. They didn't share the same values. They didn't share the same beliefs about right and wrong. And sort of the question is, how will Israel engage in that culture? Where will the Israelites sort of fit in? And the mindset would have been to just sort of isolate and withdraw and recognize that the world out there is so awful and so terrible that you don't want to have anything to do with it. And instead, what God comes to Jeremiah is he says, actually, I want you to seek the good of the city. I want you to pray for the city so that it will prosper, and seek the good of the city so that the city may flourish, because if the city flourishes, then you too will flourish. In other words, our well-being is tied up with the good of the city. And I think that's a principle that comes into play here, because our instinct oftentimes is to be fearful, and it's to withdraw and to avoid the city and to be harshly critical of the city. And it's not to say that there isn't a place to do that, and it's not to say that we aren't to have a prophetic voice in our culture. But I want to encourage you, and I want to challenge you to ask the question of yourself: are you praying for the good of the city? Are you praying for the flourishing of the city of Salem? Are you actively taking steps to seek the good of the city? There's different ways that you do that. I mean, sometimes the way that you seek the flourishing and the good of the city is through your work and through the vocation that God has put you in and called you to. Sometimes it's, if it's volunteering with an organization like, Big Brother, or it's stepping into that void. It's mentoring a kid, or it's, being a CASA for a kid in the foster care system. It's those kinds of things. Rather than that sort of default reaction of fear and withdrawal, ask yourself if you're praying for the city, number one, and ask yourself, how am I seeking the good of the city? How am I actually seeking to see to pursue the flourishing of our city? So there you have it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time when we have the opportunity to connect here on Speaking of.